My name is Thomas Carter, and at 68 years old, I stood on the sidewalk watching strangers carry my life out of the house I had owned for 43 years. One of them smiled politely and asked, "Sir, are you here to pick something up before we finish?" I stared at him. "No," I said quietly. "I think you're taking everything." He frowned. "I thought the owner already moved." "I am the owner." Before he could answer, my son, Daniel, stepped out of the front door holding a manila envelope. He looked uncomfortable, not guilty, just uncomfortable. "Hi, Dad." That was how it began. No hug, no explanation, no warning. Just two words spoken like we had run into each other at the grocery store instead of the front yard, where I'd taught him to throw a baseball, where we'd built tree houses together, where his mother planted roses every spring until cancer took her 12 years earlier. My eyes drifted toward the moving truck. Our dining table was already inside. My late wife's china cabinet followed. The rocking chair she'd bought me on our 25th anniversary disappeared behind the truck's metal door. I looked back at Daniel. "What is this?" He took a slow breath. "We sold the house." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because there are moments so impossible that your brain refuses to believe them. "You sold my house?" It was the practical thing to do. "My name is on the deed." "You signed a power of attorney before your surgery." The words landed harder than any punch I'd ever taken. 6 weeks earlier, I'd gone into the hospital for knee replacement surgery. The recovery had been slower than expected, and my insurance approved a short stay at a rehabilitation center. Daniel handled the paperwork while I focused on learning how to walk again. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. "I signed that so you could pay my bills," I whispered. "It gave me authority. It wasn't yours to sell." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The lawyer said everything was legal." Legal. Funny how people hide behind that word when they know something isn't right. A woman I'd never seen before walked out carrying a clipboard. "Daniel, closing documents are loaded," she called. Closing. So it was already done. There wasn't even a chance to stop it. I looked toward the front porch. The brass wind chime Mary had bought at an Ohio craft fair still hung beside the door. The breeze made it sing. For a second, I could almost hear my wife's voice. Then another mover took it down and tossed it into a cardboard box. Something inside me cracked. Daniel's wife, Melissa, came outside. She was dressed for the drive south in expensive sunglasses and spotless white sneakers. "We've got to leave if we're going to make Kentucky before dark." She handed me the envelope. "What's this?" "Something to help you get started." I opened it. One crisp $100 bill. Folded beside it was a piece of notebook paper. 4 words written in Daniel's handwriting. "You'll figure it out." I read them twice, then a third time. Maybe I expected another page. Maybe I expected a joke, an explanation. Anything. There was nothing else. I looked at my son. "You left me $100. You've always been resourceful." Melissa crossed her arms. "We're giving you independence." I blinked. Independence. "We didn't think you'd want to spend the rest of your life sitting in some assisted living facility." "I never asked to." "We figured you'd rather make your own choices." I stared at both of them. I didn't know becoming homeless was one of my choices. Neither answered. The silence stretched until Daniel finally spoke. "We're moving to North Carolina." "I can see that. There are better schools for Tyler. My grandson is 14. He deserves opportunities. So I don't—" His eyes dropped toward the driveway. "We couldn't afford 2 households." I almost reminded him that he'd never paid a mortgage in his life. That house had been completely paid off years ago. There wasn't a single payment left. Selling it hadn't saved him from debt. It had simply handed him hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money I'd spent 40 years earning. Money Mary and I had sacrificed vacations, new cars, and countless weekends to protect. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" Daniel hesitated. "There are motels." "With $100? Melissa sighed dramatically. "Dad, you're tougher than you think." I noticed she still called me Dad. Funny how that worked. She could call me family while helping erase every trace that I'd ever had one. A neighbor slowly walked across the street. Mrs. Henderson. She'd lived next door almost as long as we had. Her eyes were red. She hugged me without saying anything. Then she looked directly at Daniel. I hope your children never learn from this. Daniel looked away. Melissa muttered something under her breath. The moving truck pulled away, then another. Within 20 minutes, 43 years of memories had vanished down the street. Only tire tracks remained. Daniel walked over holding my old duffel bag. We packed your clothes, my clothes, and your medications. I accepted the bag. It felt surprisingly light. Everything else, every photograph, every tool, every letter Mary had ever written me, gone. I guess that's it, Daniel said. I nodded. I guess it is. He waited. Maybe he expected me to yell. Maybe he wanted me to cry. Instead, I reached into the envelope and folded the $100 bill back inside. I'll keep this. His face softened for the first time. I knew you'd understand. I almost smiled. No. He understood nothing. I walked toward my old pickup truck. It had nearly 200,000 miles on it, but it still started every morning. Unlike people, machines usually did what they promised. Mrs. Henderson caught up with me. Tom, please come stay with us. I squeezed her hand. I appreciate it. You don't have to do this alone. I know, but something inside me needed silence. Not pity, not advice, just silence. I drove until sunset. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet truck stop outside Columbus. I parked beneath a dim parking lot light. The cab smelled faintly of motor oil and old coffee. I leaned the driver's seat back as far as it would go, my new bedroom. I unfolded the note one last time. You'll figure it out. For the first time all day, I agreed with my son. I will, I whispered into the darkness, but not the way you think. That night, lying alone inside an aging pickup truck with $100 to my name, I made a promise that would shape every year I had left. I would never ask my son for another penny. And someday, whether he cared or not, he would understand exactly what he had thrown away. The first morning after sleeping in my truck, I woke up with a stiff back, a swollen knee, and absolutely no idea what came next. For 43 years, I had known exactly where I'd wake up. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew how the morning sun hit the kitchen window. I knew where Mary kept the coffee filters, even though she'd been gone for over a decade. Now I was brushing my teeth in a truck stop restroom while 18-wheelers rumbled past outside. Life changes quickly. Pride changes even faster. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the $100 bill. For a brief moment, I considered calling Daniel. Not to beg, just to ask one question. Why? But I already knew the answer. Whatever explanation he gave wouldn't change where I had slept. So I folded the money back into my wallet and drove toward downtown Columbus. Around noon, I parked outside the church Mary and I had attended for years whenever we visited the city. I wasn't expecting a miracle. I simply wanted somewhere quiet to think. Pastor Robert recognized me before I reached the front door. Tom? He looked genuinely shocked. I heard you had surgery. I did. How are you walking already? I don't have much choice. Something in my voice made him stop smiling. Come inside. An hour later, after listening without interrupting, he leaned back in his chair. I've been counseling families for 30 years, he said. Sometimes strangers treat each other better than relatives. I nodded. I don't need anyone to fix this. I know. I just need somewhere to stand long enough to figure out my next step. He smiled. Then let's start there. The church owned a small apartment above an old fellowship hall. Normally, it housed visiting missionaries or traveling guest speakers. It happened to be empty. It's not fancy, Pastor Robert said. It sounds perfect. He wouldn't let me pay rent. Instead, I promised to help around the property, fix doors, repair pews, replace broken cabinets. By the end of my first week, I had repaired nearly everything in the building that squeaked, leaked, or rattled. Working with my hands had always calmed me. Mary used to laugh whenever I repaired something. You don't just fix furniture, she'd say. You fix yourself. She was right. Every screw I tightened quieted another angry thought. Every broken hinge reminded me that damaged things weren't always worthless. One afternoon, while replacing trim in the fellowship hall, an elderly woman walked in carrying a rocking chair with one broken leg. I heard there's a man here who can fix anything. I smiled. That's a dangerous rumor. She laughed. My husband built this chair 50 years ago. I examined it carefully. Solid oak. Excellent craftsmanship. The leg had simply cracked from age. I think I can help. She asked what I charged. I shrugged. How about $20? She looked offended. That's all. It's about 2 hours' work. She shook her head. No wonder pastors like you. 3 days later, she returned with 2 more pieces of furniture. Then her sister called. Then a neighbor. Then someone from another church. Within a month, my tiny apartment looked more like a furniture workshop than a home. Pastor Robert walked in one evening and stared at chairs, tables, and cabinets lined against every wall. I think we've outgrown the guest room. I laughed. You might be right. A retired mechanic named Hank overheard us after Sunday service. I've got an old repair shop outside town. I don't need much. You need a roof. The building had once been an auto garage. The front bays were empty. The back room still had sturdy workbenches. Dust covered everything, but underneath, it had good bones. I can't afford commercial rent. Hank waved me off. Then don't. I won't take charity. It's not charity. He pointed towards several broken cabinets leaning against one wall. Fix this place up. And you can stay until business gets rolling. We shook hands. That's simple. No contracts, no lawyers. Just 2 men who believed a handshake still meant something. I spent the next several weeks cleaning, painting, building shelves, repairing lights. By the time I finished, the garage looked completely different. Customers began dropping off antiques from all over Central Ohio. Some pieces weren't valuable. Others were museum quality. I treated every single one the same, because every object carried someone's memories. You don't restore wood, you restore history. One Saturday afternoon, a young woman arrived carrying an old cedar chest. It belonged to my grandmother. The lid barely opened. Water damage had stained one side. Can you save it? I ran my fingers across the grain. I think so. She smiled hopefully. Everyone else told me it wasn't worth fixing. I looked at her. Worth fixing and worth replacing aren't the same thing. She came back 2 weeks later. The moment she saw the restored chest, tears filled her eyes. It looks exactly like I remember. No, I said gently. It looks exactly like your grandmother remembered. She hugged me before leaving. Those moments became my paycheck. Not the money, the gratitude. Word spread faster than I ever expected. Customers started driving 2, sometimes 3 hours. One antique dealer in Cincinnati called, asking whether I'd consider restoring an entire collection. I accepted. Another dealer recommended me to a historical society. Soon I had more work than I could finish alone. For the first time since losing my house, I wasn't thinking about Daniel every day. That surprised me. Pain doesn't disappear. It simply loses the argument against purpose. One evening, Pastor Robert stopped by the workshop. You've been busy. I looked around. Half-finished rocking chairs, dining tables, dressers, cabinets. I forgot how much I loved doing this. He nodded. I don't think you forgot. I think life got loud. That stayed with me. Life had gotten loud. Mortgage payments, career, raising children, hospital visits, funerals, responsibilities. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped building because I enjoyed it. I'd only built because people expected me to. Now, at nearly 70, I was finally building again for myself. Around Christmas, the local newspaper published a small article. Retired carpenter gives family heirlooms a second life. Nothing dramatic, just a human interest story. The reporter asked what inspired me. I answered honestly. I know what it's like to lose something you thought you'd have forever. Business doubled after that article. I hired my first employee, a 24-year-old veteran named Marcus, who had struggled to find steady work after leaving the Army. He showed up early, worked hard, asked questions. 3 months later, I hired another, then another. Slowly, almost without realizing it, I wasn't just rebuilding furniture anymore. I was rebuilding lives, including my own. People occasionally asked about my family. I simply smiled. They're living their own lives. That was enough. I never spoke badly about Daniel, not because he deserved protecting, because bitterness is expensive, and I had already lost enough. As winter gave way to spring, I locked up the workshop one evening and looked at the faded sign hanging above the entrance. It still read Hank's Auto Repair. I smiled. Maybe it was time for a new name, not because I wanted people to remember mine, but because after everything that had happened, I finally believed I had a future worth putting my name on. The first sign that my little workshop had become something bigger wasn't the money. It was the waiting list. One Monday morning, Marcus walked into my office carrying a clipboard and a puzzled expression. "Mr. Carter." "Yeah, we're booked 6 months out." I looked up from the workbench where I was restoring a walnut secretary desk. "What?" He handed me the schedule. Every available slot was filled. Customers from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Even a family from Virginia willing to drive 8 hours because they had heard somehow that the old man in Columbus could make broken things whole again. I leaned back in my chair. "I guess we'd better get to work." Marcus grinned. "I've been saying that for weeks." I laughed. That laugh felt different than it had 14 years earlier. Back then I'd laughed because reality had become too painful to process. Now I laughed because life had surprised me in the best possible way. We officially renamed the business that spring. Instead of Hank's Auto Repair, a handcrafted wooden sign now read Carter Heritage Restoration. Hank stood beside me during the ribbon cutting. "You know," he said, rubbing the edge of the sign with one weathered hand, "this place looks better than it ever did when I owned it." "You gave me a chance." He smiled. "No, Tom." He shook his head. "I gave you a building. You turned it into something people believe in." I never forgot those words. Buildings are made of concrete. Businesses are built on trust. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped a sharply dressed woman carrying a leather portfolio. Marcus whispered, "She looks expensive." I chuckled. "Let's hope she can afford us." She introduced herself as Rachel Morrison, an interior designer from Cleveland. One of her clients owned a historic mansion built in the late 1800s. Nearly every original piece of furniture inside needed restoration. She asked if I'd be interested. "How many pieces?" She opened the portfolio. 37. I nearly dropped my coffee. It was the biggest project we'd ever been offered. "I'll have to think about it." Rachel looked surprised. "Most people would accept immediately. Most people don't know what they're promising." I spent 2 days studying every photograph before finally saying yes. The project took almost 9 months. Every table, every chair, every cabinet, every carved headboard. Some pieces required hundreds of hours. When we finished, the homeowner invited us to see everything returned to the mansion. He walked silently through each room before turning toward me. My grandfather would have cried. "So did your furniture." He laughed. "What do you mean?" It was asking someone not to give up on it. He stood quietly for a moment. Then he shook my hand. "I'll never hire anyone else." Neither would his friends. Within a year, luxury hotels, historical societies, and museums were contacting us. Not because we advertised, because satisfied customers talked. In my experience, word of mouth travels farther than any billboard. The local television station asked if they could film a short feature. I almost declined. I'd never liked cameras. Marcus convinced me. "It's good for the business." The reporter spent an entire day inside the workshop. Instead of asking about techniques, she asked about philosophy. What makes restoration different from replacement? I picked up an old dining chair with a cracked frame. Replacement is faster. And restoration. Restoration respects the story. She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "This chair has survived birthdays, Christmas dinners, family arguments, homework, grandchildren." I smiled. Wood remembers. So do people. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. By Tuesday, our phones wouldn't stop ringing. Orders doubled. Again. Success brought a problem I never expected. I couldn't keep doing everything myself. At 74, my hands were still steady, but there were only so many hours in a day. Marcus came into my office carrying a stack of applications. "We need more people." "I know, but not just workers." "What do you mean?" "We need craftsmen." That was different. Anyone could sand wood. Not everyone could understand why an 80-year-old widow cried when you returned her husband's rocking chair looking exactly the way she remembered it. Skill mattered. Heart mattered more. So we started an apprenticeship program. Young men, young women, military veterans, single parents, former construction workers, even a high school art teacher looking for a career change. I taught every one of them the same lesson on their first day. We're not in the furniture business. Someone always asks the same question. What business are we in? I would answer, we're in the memory business. A few years later, a producer from a streaming documentary series contacted us. They were filming ordinary Americans preserving traditional craftsmanship. They wanted one episode to focus on furniture restoration. I nearly refused again. Marcus laughed. You're getting predictable. I don't like attention. You like helping people. That's different. The documentary will help more people find us. He was right. The film crew followed us for almost 2 weeks. They interviewed customers whose heirlooms we'd restored. One woman brought out her father's military trunk. I thought it was beyond saving. She looked at me. He gave me another 20 years with my dad. I didn't know what to say. You never really do in moments like that. The documentary premiered 6 months later. I watched it alone after closing the shop. Near the end, the interviewer asked me one final question. Have you ever experienced losing something you loved? I hesitated. The cameras kept rolling. Finally, I answered. 14 years ago. I looked down at my hands. Someone left me with $100 and told me I'd figure it out. The interviewer stayed silent. So, did you? I smiled. I figured out something they never expected. What was that? No one can sell your future. They can sell your house. They can take your belongings. They can walk away. But they cannot decide who you become after they leave. That line became the most quoted moment of the documentary. People began writing letters. Veterans, widows, divorced fathers, retired teachers, cancer survivors. Some thanked me for restoring furniture. Most thanked me for giving them hope. Money came faster than I ever imagined. For the first time in my life, I had more than enough. I could have bought another large house, a luxury car, taken expensive vacations. Instead, I kept driving the same old pickup truck. I still packed my lunch. I still swept the workshop floor every evening before locking up. Marcus teased me constantly. You know you're the richest guy in the building. I also own the broom, he laughed. So I use it. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. They were looking for businesses willing to mentor young adults aging out of foster care. I read the letter 3 times. Then I looked around the workshop. I remembered sleeping in my truck. I remembered wondering whether anyone cared if I existed. Nobody should begin adulthood feeling abandoned. I called Marcus into my office. We're starting something new. He sat down. What kind of project? Not a project. A promise. Within a year, Carter Heritage Restoration had launched a scholarship and apprenticeship program that paid young adults while teaching them a skilled trade. Watching those kids gain confidence reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten. The greatest thing you can build isn't furniture, it's people. I never imagined that one quiet interview about an old workshop would eventually travel far beyond Ohio. But somewhere, many miles away, someone who shared my last name was about to hear it for the very first time. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to wonder whether my phone would ring. Not because no one called anymore. Quite the opposite. Customers called, suppliers called, museum directors called, young apprentices called when they accidentally glued something backward. Life had become wonderfully ordinary. The kind of ordinary I'd once believed had been stolen from me forever. Every morning followed nearly the same rhythm. Coffee at 6, open the workshop at 7, walk through every station before anyone else arrived, check moisture levels in the lumber, sharpen tools, sweep the floor. I like being the first one there. Wood has its own silence before a building fills with voices. It reminded me that every day begins unfinished. Just like people. One Tuesday morning, Marcus walked in carrying a tablet. You made the news again. I sighed dramatically. Did someone finally complain that I'm too stubborn? He laughed. No. He tapped the screen. The governor visited that workforce training center yesterday. So, they mentioned your apprenticeship program. I looked at the article. There it was. A photograph of 6 apprentices standing beside me. Most of them had grown up in foster care. Some had struggled with homelessness. One had recently become the first person in his family to buy a home. The article wasn't really about me. It was about second chances, exactly the way I wanted it. Marcus smiled. You've built something bigger than furniture. I've built people who don't need me anymore. That's the goal. It always was. About 700 miles away in a quiet neighborhood outside Raleigh, North Carolina, my grandson Ethan was sitting at his family's kitchen table. I didn't know any of this until much later. After everything happened, Ethan told me the entire story. It began with homework. His American history teacher assigned every student the same project. Research someone in your family who made a difference in their community. Most students chose grandparents, military veterans, teachers, firefighters, business owners. Ethan wasn't especially close to his grandparents. His mother's parents lived in Florida. As for me, he remembered almost nothing. Only scattered childhood images, a deep laugh, a wooden toy train, someone lifting him onto broad shoulders when he was very small. When he asked Daniel about me over dinner, the room reportedly became quiet. "What about Grandpa Tom?" Ethan asked. Daniel barely looked up from his plate. "We lost touch years ago." "Why? It's complicated." Melissa quickly changed the subject. "You could do the project on your great-grandfather instead." But teenagers are naturally curious, especially when adults refuse to answer simple questions. Later that night, Ethan opened his laptop. He typed 2 words, Thomas Carter, then he hit enter. The first result surprised him. Carter Heritage Restoration, preserving America's family history. The second surprised him even more. A magazine profile. From homeless senior to master craftsman, the inspiring story of Thomas Carter. Then came another, and another, a television interview, a documentary, photographs of me standing beside apprentices, articles about our scholarship program, awards, community recognition, a speech I'd given at a vocational education conference. Ethan later admitted something that broke my heart. "I thought maybe there had to be 2 Thomas Carters." He couldn't imagine the grandfather no one ever talked about becoming someone people wrote articles about. He clicked the documentary, the same one I'd almost refused to film years earlier. He watched quietly for nearly an hour. Near the end came the interview. The producer asked me the question that had stayed with viewers across the country. "Have you ever experienced losing something you loved?" I answered exactly as I remembered. 14 years ago. I paused. Someone left me with $100 and told me I'd figure it out. The interviewer asked softly, "Did you?" I smiled. I figured out something they never expected. "What was that?" "No one can sell your future." The documentary never mentioned names, never accused anyone, never showed photographs of my family. It wasn't about revenge, it was about resilience. But Ethan knew. He recognized the age, the timeline, the $100, and one sentence he'd heard his father say years earlier without understanding its meaning. "He'll figure it out." He froze. Then he replayed the interview, again and again. When Daniel came downstairs the next morning, Ethan was already sitting at the kitchen table. The laptop remained open. My face filled the screen. Daniel stopped walking. According to Ethan, all the color drained from his father's face. "Dad!" Daniel didn't answer. Ethan asked quietly, "Is that Grandpa?" Silence. "Dad!" Melissa walked into the kitchen carrying a coffee mug. The moment she saw the screen, she stopped too. No one spoke. Finally, Ethan whispered, "The documentary says someone left him with $100. He looked at his father. "Was that you?" Daniel lowered himself into a chair, very slowly, as though his knees suddenly no longer worked. Ethan had never seen his father cry. Not when relatives died. Not during financial struggles. Not even after losing a business. That morning, he did. He covered his face with both hands. "I'm so sorry." Those were apparently the first words out of his mouth. Melissa began crying too. For several minutes, no one spoke. The documentary continued playing in the background. My voice filled the room. "Forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It simply keeps pain from becoming your future." Daniel stared at the screen. "I never thought..." Melissa finished the sentence. That he'd make it. Daniel nodded without looking up. I thought, his voice cracked, I thought he'd end up in assisted living somewhere. Instead, he had built a nationally respected company, a scholarship foundation, a life without them. That afternoon, Daniel searched for my business website. The contact page listed one office number. He called. Marcus answered. Carter Heritage Restoration. Daniel hesitated. Is Thomas Carter available? May I ask who's calling? A long silence. Finally, Daniel whispered, I'm his son. Marcus later told me that even through the phone, he could hear regret. He transferred the call to my office. I glanced at the unfamiliar North Carolina number. Something inside me knew. I let it ring. Voicemail answered. 5 minutes later, he called again. Then Melissa called. Then another number. Then another. By evening, I had 23 missed calls. The next morning, there were 68. Then 94. Then 140. Voicemails began filling my inbox. Please call us. We need to talk. We're sorry. Ethan wants to meet you. I know I don't deserve this. I listened to none of them. Not because I hated my son, because 14 years earlier, he hadn't wanted to hear a single word from me either. By the end of the second day, my phone displayed a number I never imagined I'd see. 217 missed calls. Marcus looked over from the workbench. You planning to answer any of those? I slipped the phone back into my pocket. No. You angry? I thought carefully before answering. No. Then why not? I looked around the workshop, at the apprentices laughing together, at the furniture waiting to be restored, at the life I'd spent 14 years quietly building. Then I smiled. Because after all this time, I finally get to choose when the conversation begins. I didn't return a single phone call for 8 days. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted Daniel to suffer. I simply wasn't ready to reopen a chapter that had taken 14 years to close. Every voicemail sounded almost the same. Please call. I'm sorry. We need to talk. Then one message sounded different. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Melissa. It was Ethan. His voice was young, nervous, and uncertain. Hi, Grandpa? He hesitated for several seconds. I don't even know if I should call you that. Another pause. I'm not calling because of money. I don't want anything. I'd really like to meet you. If you don't want to, I understand. But if you ever change your mind, his voice cracked, I'd like to know the man everyone else seems to admire. The message ended. I listened to it 3 more times. Marcus walked into my office carrying invoices. You okay? Instead of answering, I handed him my phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked at me. That's not your son. No, that's a kid looking for his grandfather. I leaned back in my chair. I know. So what are you going to do? I stared through the office window at the workshop floor. Young apprentices laughed while sanding a dining table. For years, I'd taught them one lesson above all others. Don't punish someone for damage they didn't cause. Children don't inherit broken furniture, neither do they inherit guilt. I think I finally said, I'm going to meet my grandson. We agreed to meet on a Saturday morning, not at a restaurant, not at my office, at the workshop. If Ethan wanted to know me, he should see the place that had rebuilt my life. I arrived earlier than usual. Old habit, coffee in one hand, shop keys in the other. I unlocked the front door. The smell of walnut cherry and fresh sawdust greeted me like an old friend. By 10 o'clock, the apprentices had gone home for the weekend. The building was quiet, exactly the way I wanted it. At 10:15, a silver SUV pulled into the parking lot. Only one person stepped out, a tall, skinny young man with nervous eyes. He looked around before spotting me standing in the doorway. For a second, we simply stared at each other. Then he smiled. It was Daniel's smile, only kinder. You must be Ethan. He nodded. Hi. He laughed awkwardly. I've practiced saying this all week. So have I. He walked toward me. I wasn't sure if I should hug you. I wasn't sure either. So we shook hands. Then almost at the same time, we both laughed. The tension disappeared. Come inside. For the next 2 hours, I showed him everything. The woodworking shop, the finishing room, the restoration studio, the training classrooms. Every apprentice stopped to introduce themselves. Several greeted me with, "Morning, Mr. Carter." Others simply called me Tom. Ethan noticed. "They really like you." I hope they respect me. I think they do both. We stopped beside an antique oak table waiting for repair. "What happened to this one?" "House fire." "Can it be saved?" I ran my hand across the burned edge. "It'll always carry the scar." So we'll make the scar part of the story." He smiled thoughtfully. "I think that's kind of beautiful." I looked at him. "That's true for people too." Around lunchtime, we sat together in the small employee break room, eating sandwiches Marcus had insisted on bringing. Neither of us talked much. Sometimes silence isn't awkward. Sometimes it's honest. Finally, Ethan looked down at his paper cup. "I'm sorry," I frowned. "For what?" "My family. You didn't sell my house." "I know." "You didn't leave me $100. "No." "You didn't tell me to figure it out." He shook his head. "But they're my parents." I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. "Listen carefully." He looked up. "Children don't inherit guilt." His eyes filled with tears. "I've felt awful ever since I watched that documentary." "I know." I kept thinking. His voice trembled. "If I'd known you earlier." "You were a child." "I could have called." "You didn't know." "I should have asked more questions." I smiled softly. "And now you are." For the first time since arriving, he relaxed completely. That afternoon, another vehicle entered the parking lot. I hadn't invited anyone else, but somehow, I wasn't surprised. Daniel stepped out first. Melissa followed several feet behind. They both looked older than I remembered. Daniel's hair had turned mostly gray. His shoulders slumped. Life had clearly been less generous to him than he'd expected. He walked toward the shop slowly, not confidently, like a man approaching his own sentencing. Marcus glanced through the window. "You want me to ask them to leave?" "No. You sure? I've waited 14 years. I can wait another 5 minutes." Marcus nodded and quietly disappeared into the back office. Daniel stopped several feet away from me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked around the workshop. "I've seen pictures." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "But," he swallowed hard, "I didn't understand." I nodded. "No, I didn't." He looked at the apprentices' workstations, the framed newspaper articles, the awards hanging quietly along one wall, photographs of scholarship graduates, veterans, families, young men and women smiling beside restored furniture. "This," he looked around again. "You built all this with a lot of help." He covered his face with one hand. I thought. He stopped, then tried again. "I honestly thought after we left," his voice cracked, "you'd end up in a nursing home." "I know. I never imagined." "I know." Melissa stepped forward. Tears streamed down her face. "We told ourselves it was temporary." Neither I nor Daniel said anything. She continued anyway. "We kept saying we'd check on you after we got settled. Then months passed. Then years. And every year it became harder to admit what we'd done." Daniel stared at the floor. "I was ashamed," I answered quietly. "You should have been." He nodded immediately. "I was. For 14 years. Daniel finally looked directly into my eyes. "I've replayed that day thousands of times." "So have I." "I don't expect forgiveness." "I know. I don't deserve another chance." "I know." He took a deep breath. "I just needed you to hear something." I waited. "I'm sorry." Not the quick kind of apology people offer to end uncomfortable conversations. This one came slowly, painfully, like every word had to fight its way out. "I was greedy. I was selfish. I convinced myself selling your house was practical. I told myself you'd be fine." He looked around the workshop one last time. "The truth is, I chose convenience over my father." Silence settled over the room. Even the shop seemed to stop breathing. Then Ethan quietly stood and walked beside his father. He placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder, not to defend him, simply to keep him standing. For the first time in 14 years, I saw not the man who had abandoned me, but a broken son finally telling the truth. Whether that truth would be enough, I still didn't know. But it was finally a place where healing could begin. No one moved. For what felt like a full minute, the workshop was completely silent. Outside, a light rain had started tapping against the windows. Inside, 3 generations of one family stood surrounded by furniture that had survived fires, floods, neglect, and time. I couldn't help noticing the irony. People had always brought me broken things because they believed they could still be saved. Now my own family was standing in front of me, broken, waiting to see whether I believed the same about them. Daniel cleared his throat. I've rehearsed this conversation for weeks. I figured. I wanted to explain everything. I gently shook my head. You don't owe me an explanation. His shoulders fell. I owe you one. Maybe. I looked him in the eye. But explanations and excuses often wear the same clothes. He nodded slowly. I know. I've had 14 years to think. So have I. For the first time since he'd arrived, neither of us was trying to win. We were simply telling the truth. Daniel pulled a folded envelope from his jacket. I brought something. He handed it to me. Inside was a cashier's check. The amount made me blink. It represented nearly every dollar he had received from selling my house all those years ago, along with years of accumulated interest. I sold our house for this. He looked away. I know it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't. I don't expect you to cash it. I brought it because it was never mine. I folded the check and handed it back. No, he looked confused. Dad, I don't want it. You earned it. No, I smiled sadly. I earned it before you ever sold the house. He lowered his hand. What do I do with it? That's your decision. He stared at the check as though it had suddenly become heavier. I've carried the weight of that money for 14 years. I believe you, and you don't want it back. I looked around the workshop. Every beam, every workbench, every apprentice, every restored family heirloom waiting for its owners. I already turned $100 into everything you see here. I smiled gently. I don't need the rest. Ethan quietly wiped his eyes. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I hope not. A few weeks later, Daniel called again. This time I answered, not because everything had been repaired, because healing requires conversations, sometimes many of them. We talked for nearly 3 hours about his mistakes, about my loneliness, about Mary's death, about the fear he'd felt after I became less mobile following surgery. Eventually, he admitted something that surprised even him. I wasn't trying to get rid of you. I stayed quiet. I was terrified. Of what? Watching you become old. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. When Mom died, he said, I convinced myself I could solve every problem. You couldn't. No. When your surgery happened, he sighed, I panicked. You made a terrible decision. I made dozens. He laughed bitterly. I kept telling myself I'd fix everything later. I nodded. Later is one of the most dangerous words in the English language. It is. Later became 14 years. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I asked the question that had lived inside me since that day on the sidewalk. Why the note? He took a long breath. I wish I had a good answer. You don't. No. I wrote it because... His voice broke. I wanted to believe you'd be okay. I closed my eyes. You weren't trying to encourage me. No, you were trying to comfort yourself. A long silence followed. Finally, he whispered, yes. Forgiveness didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single conversation. It wasn't a dramatic hug. It wasn't forgetting. Forgiveness arrived quietly, one ordinary moment at a time. Daniel started calling every Sunday. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. Melissa wrote me a handwritten letter, not an email, not a text, a real letter. She apologized without defending herself, without blaming stress, without blaming youth, without blaming anyone else. I wrote back, only 3 sentences. Thank you for telling the truth. I forgive you. Now live differently. That was enough. Ethan became a regular visitor. Every few months he'd drive from North Carolina to Ohio. He wanted to learn woodworking. The first time he picked up a hand plane, he looked nervous. "I've never done this before." I smiled. Neither had I. When? The first time. He laughed. Over the next 2 years, he learned how to repair dovetail joints, how to match wood grain, how to finish walnut without hiding its character. More importantly, he learned patience. One Saturday afternoon, while sanding an old maple dresser, he asked, "Grandpa, yeah, will I ever work here?" I set my tools down. "Do you want the honest answer?" "Always." "You'll never work here because you're my grandson." His face fell slightly. Then I continued, "You'll work here if you earn it." His smile returned. "I'd rather earn it." "I know you would." And he did. When he graduated from college, he didn't ask for a management office. He started exactly where every apprentice started, sweeping floors, sorting lumber, learning. Nobody received special treatment, especially family. On my 84th birthday, our entire team gathered inside the workshop. Employees, former apprentices, families, veterans we'd hired, scholarship recipients. The building overflowed with laughter. Marcus walked to the front holding a small wooden box. "I've got something." He opened it carefully. Inside lay the old $100 bill, the very one Daniel had left me. I stared at it in disbelief. "I thought you spent it years ago," Marcus said. I smiled. I never could. Instead of spending it years earlier, I had quietly framed it behind glass with a handwritten note beside it. Marcus had borrowed the display for the celebration. Below the frame was a brass plaque. It read, "Someone once believed this was enough to end a man's future. They were wrong." The room erupted into applause. I looked across the crowd. Daniel stood beside Ethan. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything. Several months later, I signed the final legal documents creating the Carter Heritage Foundation. The business would eventually become employee-owned. No child would automatically inherit it. No grandchild would automatically control it. The people who built it together would own it together. The scholarship program expanded nationwide. Every year, young adults aging out of foster care received training, housing assistance, and paid apprenticeships. People often asked why I focused so much on them. My answer never changed. Because no young person should ever wonder if they've been left behind. That mission mattered more than profit ever could. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see on that lonely night in my pickup truck. Losing my house wasn't the deepest wound. Losing the belief that my own son wanted me, that was the wound. And rebuilding a business wasn't my greatest victory. Rebuilding a family was. Not the family we used to be. That family was gone. But something new grew in its place. Something humbler. Something honest. Something built on truth instead of appearances. If you're listening today and someone has made you feel disposable because of your age, your circumstances, or your past, don't let their opinion become your identity. People can take your possessions, they can walk away, they can underestimate you, but they cannot decide the value of your life. Only you decide what you build from what's left in your hands, and sometimes, the smallest beginning becomes the strongest foundation. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal. Your story may encourage someone who needs hope today. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, family forgiveness, and quiet justice, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.